Imagine for a moment that you're standing on what feels like the most solid ground imaginable. The very foundations of how we know anything, how we divide what's true by definition from what's true by fact. But what if one of the greatest philosophical minds of the 20th century, gently but relentlessly, showed us that some of those foundational stones were actually, well, illusions? What if he revealed that our basic assumptions about meaning, truth, and even reality itself were built on shaky ground? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into just such a seismic event in philosophy. W.V.O. Quine's seminal 1951 essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. This essay wasn't just a critique, it was a revolutionary challenge to modern empiricist thought. Quine identified two core beliefs, or dogma as he called them, that had largely conditioned how philosophers thought about knowledge for centuries. He argued these were ill-founded, and his arguments fundamentally reshaped how we think about knowledge, meaning, and even the very nature of science itself. Our mission today is to unpack Quine's precise and rigorous arguments against these two dogmas. First, the belief in a fundamental cleavage, a sharp divide, between analytic and synthetic truths, those supposedly true by meaning alone versus those true by virtue of observable fact. And second, reductionism, the powerful, intuitive idea that every meaningful statement can ultimately be reduced or broken down to immediate sensory experience. But here's the true brilliance of Quine's work. His critique doesn't just tear down, it offers a powerful alternative vision. He proposes that knowledge is actually a holistic web of belief that faces experience as a corporate body, as a unified whole, rather than as individual isolated statements. This radical reorientation, as we'll explore, didn't just rattle the philosophical establishment, it fundamentally shifted the landscape of philosophy, notably leading to what is now known as naturalised epistemology.
That's absolutely right. Two Dogmas of Empiricism isn't merely a historical artifact that sits in a dusty archive. Its impact resonates powerfully, even today, in how we construct, revise, and understand our knowledge of the world. Quine effectively peeled back layers of assumptions that many philosophers just took for granted, assumptions that felt almost, well, self-evident. He wasn't just refining existing ideas, he was fundamentally questioning the very categories we use to sort our understanding of truth. So to really understand this profound shift, let's begin by examining that first dogma, the analytic-synthetic distinction.
Okay, let's unpack this first dogma. The sharp split between analytic truths, which are supposedly true by meaning alone and independent of fact, and synthetic truths, which are true by virtue of fact. This distinction feels so intuitive, doesn't it? Like all bachelors are unmarried men is just true because of what the words mean, while the cat is on the mat is true because of how the world is. Where did this idea come from, and how did Quine begin to chip away at something that felt so obvious?
It does feel intuitive, and that's precisely why it became such a deeply ingrained dogma. The idea of this fundamental distinction has deep historical roots, going back centuries before Quine. You can see precursors in David Hume's differentiation between relations of ideas and matters of fact. Hume suggested that relations of ideas were things like mathematical truths or logical deductions, statements whose truth was discoverable by pure thought, without needing any input from the world. For instance, 2 + 2 = 4, or all triangles have 3 sides.
Right, things you just know by thinking about them.
Exactly. Matters of fact, on the other hand, were about the world, and their truth depended entirely on how things actually were. Like, the sun will rise tomorrow. You have to check the world for that one.
Okay, so Hume set the stage.
He did. And Leibniz also contributed significantly with his concept of truths of reason, which he famously described as being true in all possible worlds, meaning they could not possibly be false.
Yeah.
In simpler terms, these are statements whose denials would be self-contradictory. If you denied them, you'd be saying something logically impossible.
Like denying A is A.
Precisely. Then Immanuel Kant later formalized this distinction, giving it the terms analytic and synthetic that Quine uses. Kant defined an analytic statement as one that attributes nothing new to its subject that isn't already conceptually contained within it. So, in All Bachelors Are Unmarried Men, the idea of unmarried man is already, in a sense, contained within the concept of bachelor. For Kant, this meant you could know it was true just by analyzing the concepts involved.
That word contained feels a bit metaphorical, though.
Exactly. Quine's point. He points out two key shortcomings right away in Kant's formulation. First, Kant's definition limits itself to statements of subject-predicate form-meaning sentences, where you have a subject and then you attribute something to it. But not all statements fit this neat grammatical structure. And second, more critically for Quine, Kant's definition appeals to this notion of containment that is left at a purely metaphorical level. What does it actually mean for one concept to be contained within another? It's not a precise or clearly defined concept. It's a feeling, a metaphor, rather than a rigorous logical principle.
Okay, so Kant's version had limitations. How did Quine try to sharpen it?
Well, Quine, understanding Kant's underlying intent, restated it more directly, trying to make it more precise. An analytic statement is one that is true by virtue of meanings and independently of fact, unquote. This sounds straightforward, perhaps even like a good working definition. But, as Quine systematically shows, the moment you try to pin down meaning or independently of fact, you run into trouble. For instance, the definition of analytic statements as whose denials are self-contradictory might seem helpful at first, but Quine argues this definition has small explanatory value. The notion of self-contradictoriness, especially in the broad sense needed here, is itself just as much a needed clarification as analyticity. As he famously puts it, the two notions are the two sides of a single dubious coin. We're caught in an initial circularity right from the start.
That's a really crucial point. So, the very foundational definition of an analytic statement already has this inherent circularity, this hidden assumption. It's like trying to explain the color red by saying it's the color of a stop sign, and then when someone asks what a stop sign looks like, you say it's that red sign. You never truly break out of the circle to a fundamental explanation. But you mentioned that Quine then turns his attention to the concept of meaning itself. How does he break down what meaning is, and more importantly, what it isn't?
Exactly. Once you try to define analyticity through meaning, you immediately have to grapple with what meaning actually entails. And Quine starts by making a crucial distinction, one that sounds simple but is often confused in philosophical discourse. Meaning is not to be identified with naming or reference.
Meaning isn't naming. Okay, unpack that.
Let's use Frege's classic example. Evening star and morning star. Both terms name the same celestial body, Venus. Yet their meanings are clearly distinct. The statement evening star, morning star is not something we know by simply understanding the words. It's a statement of fact established by astronomical observation. If their meanings were identical, then evening star, morning star would be an analytic truth, knowable purely by conceptual analysis, which it isn't. It was a groundbreaking astronomical discovery.
Right, you needed a telescope, not just a dictionary.
Precisely. Similarly, Bertrand Russell's example of Scott, and the author of Waverley, illustrates this. George IV, for instance, needed more than just a grasp of the words. He needed factual information to know they referred to the same person. This distinction also applies to abstract terms like 9 and the number of planets. Both name the same abstract entity, but again, astronomical observation, not mere reflection on meanings, was required to determine their identity. These are all empirical facts, not truths of meaning.
So meaning isn't just about what a word points to in the world. It's the richness of the concept itself. And this distinction applies to more general terms too, like creature with a heart.
Precisely. This distinction is also important when we move from singular terms, which aim to name a specific entity, to general terms or predicates, like creature with a heart. While a singular term aims to name a specific entity, a general term is true of multiple entities, or none. The extension of a general term is the class of all entities it is true of. So for creature with a heart, its extension is the set of all creatures that have hearts.
Okay, the set of things it applies to.
Right. Now compare creature with a heart and creature with a kidney. They are perhaps alike in extension, meaning they refer to the same set of creatures in the actual world, since, as a matter of biological fact, all creatures with hearts also have kidneys and vice versa. But they are clearly unlike in meaning. The concept of a heart is different from the concept of a kidney. This opposition of intention, meaning or concept, to extension, the set of things that applies to, or connotation to denotation, is a common idea in philosophy.
So far, so good. But where does Quine take this?
What Quine then highlights is his deep skepticism about meanings as entities. What are these things we call meanings? Are they abstract Platonic forms? Mental representations? He finds them elusive, not to say debatable, suggesting there's little hope of erecting a fruitful science about them. The core difficulty, he argues, is that it's not even clear granted meanings when we have two and when we have one. It is not clear when linguistic forms should be regarded as synonymous or alike in meaning and when they should not. Because of this inherent ambiguity, this fuzziness about what meanings actually are, Quine suggests we should abandon meanings themselves as obscure intermediary entities, and instead recognize the business of the theory of meaning as simply the synonymy of linguistic forms and the analyticity of statements. This shifts the focus from mysterious mental or Platonic entities to the observable relationships between words and statements themselves.
Okay, so forget meaning as some kind of object. Focus on synonymy when words mean the same thing. How does that help Quine dissect the different types of analytic statements? He talks about two classes, right? And it seems the second class, dependent on synonymy, is where the real challenge lies.
Precisely. Quine distinguishes between two classes of statements that are generally accepted as analytic. The first class he calls logically true statements, exemplified by something like, no unmarried man is married. The key feature here is that such a statement is not just true as it stands, but remains true under any and all reinterpretations of its non-logical components, like man or married. The logical particles, such as no and if, then, and, remain fixed and ensure its truth. This class, Quine concedes, seems relatively straightforward. It's true simply by its logical structure.
Seems pretty solid. Nothing controversial there, really.
Right. The difficulty, however, lies squarely with the second class of analytic statements. These are typified by statements like, all bachelors are unmarried men. The characteristic feature of these statements is that they can be turned into a logical truth like, no unmarried man is married, simply by putting synonyms for synonyms, such as replacing bachelor with unmarried man. The critical hurdle here is that, as Quine states, we still lack a proper characterization of this second class, inasmuch as we have had in the above description to lean on a notion of synonymy, which is no less in need of clarification than analyticity itself. We're back to the original problem. How do we rigorously define synonymy without already presupposing analyticity? It's that circularity again.
That makes perfect sense. It feels like we're always circling back to the same problem. Trying to define analytic or synonymous always seems to rely on the very concept we're trying to define. And when people try to define bachelor as unmarried man, they often instinctively point to dictionary definitions. But Quine seems to have a very clear and critical view of how definition relates to synonymy. Can you elaborate on his critique of definition? Why isn't a dictionary good enough for him?
Absolutely. It's a common misconception, as you said, that statements like, all bachelors are unmarried men are analytic simply because bachelor is defined as unmarried man in a dictionary. But Quine argues this is a profound misunderstanding. He states, clearly this would be to put the cart before the horse.
Putting the cart before the horse. How so?
He explains that a lexicographer, a dictionary writer, is fundamentally an empirical scientist. Their business is to record antecedent facts, meaning pre-existing synonymies already implicit in general or preferred usage of a language. They don't create these synonymies. If a lexicographer glosses bachelor as unmarried man, it's because they've observed that relationship in how people actually use the language prior to their writing it down. So, the lexicographer's report of an observed synonymy cannot be taken as the ground of the synonymy. The synonymy must already exist for the definition to be accurate. A dictionary is a descriptive tool, not a prescriptive one that dictates meaning in a foundational sense.
So the dictionary just reports usage. It doesn't create the synonymy itself.
Exactly. Quine then considers other forms of definition. Philosophers and scientists often define terms, but ordinarily, he says, such a definition is pure lexicography, merely affirming a relationship of synonymy antecedent to the exposition in hand. It's just reporting what's already there.
Okay, but what about when scientists or philosophers do seem to create definitions, like clarifying a concept?
Right, that's the more nuanced variant type of definitional activity that Rudolf Carnap called explication. This is where philosophers or scientists try to improve or refine a meaning, not just paraphrase it. The purpose here isn't simply to report a pre-existing synonymy between the old term, the definendum, and the new definition, the definiens. For instance, explicating the term truth to make it more precise for logical purposes.
Does that escape Quine's critique?
Not entirely. Crucially, even explication rests nevertheless on other pre-existing synonymies. The idea is that any term worth explicating has some context which, as wholes, are clear and precise enough to be useful. The explication then tries to preserve the usage of these favored contexts while sharpening the usage of other contexts. So while an explication can, by fiat, generate a relationship of synonymy that didn't exist before, this new synonymy still owes its explicative function to pre-existing synonymies that connect the old term to the favored contexts. It's not a fresh, ground-up creation of meaning. It's a refinement that leverages existing, albeit perhaps vague, understanding.
So even refining a definition relies on existing meanings.
Yes. Quine identifies only one extreme sort of definition which does not hark back to prior synonymies at all: the explicitly conventional introduction of novel notations for purposes of sheer abbreviation. Think of creating a new scientific symbol or a made-up word, like QZ to mean quantum zealous. Here, the new term becomes synonymous with its definition, simply because it has been created expressly for the purpose of being synonymous with the definitions. This is the truly transparent case of synonymy created by definition. He wistfully states, "Would that all species of synonymy were as intelligible." But this is a rare, artificial case, utterly different from how natural language evolves. For the vast majority of cases, he concludes, definition rests on synonymy rather than explaining it. The notion of definition doesn't provide the foundational explanation for synonymy, or, by extension, analyticity.
So, definition is out as a foundational explanation for synonymy that pushes us back to this elusive concept. But there's another very intuitive idea, often associated with Leibniz, that Quine takes aim at. The idea that synonyms can simply be swapped out without changing a sentence's truth. This sounds like a concrete test, doesn't it? Does it hold up to Quine's scrutiny?
It is indeed a very natural and appealing suggestion, and it goes like this. If two linguistic forms are truly synonymous, they should be interchangeable in all contexts without change of truth value. This is often called interchangeability, salva verite, which is Latin for saving the truth. Quine even notes that this approach can accommodate terms that are vague so long as their vagueness match.
Seems practical. Just swap bachelor for unmarried man, see if the sentence stays true.
Well, Quine quickly shows its limitations. Take our old friends, bachelor and unmarried man. While they seem interchangeable in many straightforward sentences, problems arise with phrases like Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor's Buttons. Substituting unmarried man into these phrases clearly changes their meaning or makes them nonsensical. You wouldn't say unmarried man of arts. Even more simply, consider quotation, bachelor has less than 10 letters. If you substitute unmarried man, you get unmarried man has less than 10 letters, which is false. The truth value changes because you're talking about the word itself, not its meaning.
So the meaning of the words isn't the only thing determining truth in those cases. The actual form of the words matters.
Exactly. Quine suggests that one might try to set aside such counterexamples by treating phrases like Bachelor of Arts or quoted words as single indivisible words, meaning you can't substitute parts of them. But this just moves the problem from synonymy to defining wordhood, which, as he notes, can be counted on to present difficulties of formulation in its turn. So you've just shifted the problem to another murky area, not solved it.
Okay, so there are tricky edge cases. But does the core idea work for the kind of synonymy we need for analyticity?
That's the deeper issue. Even if we grant the wordhood solution, the deeper problem remains. Is interchangeability salvate veritate a strong enough condition for the kind of synonymy needed to explain analyticity? We're concerned with cognitive synonymy, the kind where substitution into an analytic statement would yield another analytic statement or logical truth. If we already assumed analyticity, we could define cognitive synonymy. For example, bachelor and unmarried man are cognitively synonymous if the statement all and only bachelors are unmarried men is analytic. But the goal here is to define analyticity from synonymy, not the other way around. We're trying to build up to a definition of analyticity, not start with it.
Back to the circle again?
Precisely. Quine then sets up an argument that appears on the surface to show interchangeability can define cognitive synonymy. Consider statement 4. Necessarily all and only bachelors are bachelors. This statement is evidently true, assuming necessarily is used to apply only to analytic statements. Now, if bachelor and unmarried man are interchangeable salva veritate, then substituting unmarried man for bachelor in 4 should yield another true statement. 5. Necessarily, all and only bachelors are unmarried men. And if 5 is true, it implies that 3, all and only bachelors are unmarried men, is analytic, which in turn means bachelor and unmarried man are cognitively synonymous. This looks like a neat logical deduction.
It does. It seems to close the loop. But I'm guessing Quine has a problem with it, given our earlier discussion about circularity. Is this another instance of that closed curve in space you mentioned?
It's exactly right. Quine calls this argument hocus pocus. He points out that this argument supposes we are working with a language rich enough to contain the adverb necessarily, this adverb being so construed as to yield truth when and only when applied to an analytic statement. The critical flaw is that to suppose that it does is to suppose that we've already made satisfactory sense of analytic. Then what are we so hard at work on right now? It's not flatly circular, but something like it. It has the form, figuratively speaking, of a closed curve in space. We're back to presupposing what we're trying to define. It's like trying to prove that a specific key opens a certain lock by already assuming you know which key works for that lock, then just showing it fits. You're using the answer to justify the question.
So that necessarily just smuggled analyticity back in.
Pretty much. He then considers a simpler extensional language, one where truth is determined purely by the objects terms refer to, not by their meanings. In such a language, if bachelor and unmarried man are interchangeable salva veritate, it assures us of no more than that all and only bachelors or unmarried men is true. The crucial distinction is that there is no assurance here that the extensional agreement rests on meaning rather than merely on accidental matters of fact, as does extensional agreement of creature with a heart and creature with a kidney. The agreement could just be a coincidence of the world, a mere factual regularity, not a matter of shared meaning. Therefore, in an extensional language, interchangeability salva veritate is not a sufficient condition for the kind of cognitive synonymy needed to explain analyticity. So depending on the language, whether it's rich enough to contain modal adverbs like necessarily, or a simpler extensional one interchangeability, is either circular or insufficient. It fails as a general test for the kind of synonymy needed to support analyticity.
So, the concept of analyticity seems to crumble under scrutiny in natural language. Quine has systematically shown how attempts to define it, whether through simple definitions or the seemingly rigorous test of interchangeability, lead to circularity or insufficiency. But what about creating perfectly precise artificial languages with explicit semantical rules? Surely, if we construct a language from the ground up, we could solve the problem there, right? We could just declare what's analytic.
That's a very intuitive thought, and one that many philosophers, especially logical positivists like Carnap, explored with great rigor. They believed that while natural language might be messy, a perfectly designed artificial language could reveal the underlying logic of meaning. However, Quine argues quite forcefully that this is a confusion and dismisses it, rather poetically, as a will-o'-the-wisp, a fleeting, deceptive light that promises solutions but delivers none. He believes the problem of analyticity's definition is not perceptibly less for artificial languages than for natural ones.
A will-o'-the-wisp. So even designing a language from scratch doesn't fix it. Why not?
Quine examines different forms of how these semantic rules might work. Imagine an artificial language, L0, where the rules explicitly specify, say, by recursion, all the analytic statements of L0. The rules would state, such and such statements, and only those, are the analytic statements of L0. The problem, Quine argues, is that the rules contain the word analytic, which we do not understand. While we understand what expressions the rules attribute analyticity to, we still don't understand what analyticity is in a general sense. In short, a rule like, a statement S is analytic for language L0 if and only if, still presupposes a general understanding of analytic, which is exactly what we're trying to clarify. We haven't explained the general idiom S is analytic for L with variable S and L. It's like writing a rule that says the special words of the special words. It tells you which ones they are, but not why they're special.
Okay, so just listing them doesn't define the property itself. What if the rules define truth instead?
That's the second approach Quine considers. What if, instead, the rules specify which statements are true? In the second form, a semantical rule stipulates a set of statements that are included among the truths of the language. Then, analyticity could be demarcated thus. A statement is analytic if it is not merely true, but true according to the semantical rule. But again, Quine argues, still there's really no progress. Now we're appealing to an unexplained phrase, semantical rule. How do we distinguish a semantical rule from any other true statement? If any true statement that says statements of some class are true could count as a semantical rule, then all truths would be analytic in the sense of being true according to semantical rules. He finds that semantical rules are distinguishable, apparently, only by the fact of appearing on a page under the heading semantical rules, and this heading is itself then meaningless without an external definition.
So just putting a label semantical rules on something doesn't magically make it a foundational truth. That makes sense. It's arbitrary.
Exactly. Quine provides a powerful analogy here, comparing the notion of a semantical rule to that of a postulate. He states that the word postulate is significant only relative to an act of inquiry. Any selection of statements, whether finite or infinite, can be considered a set of postulates if we choose to focus on them for a particular purpose or argument. There's nothing intrinsic that makes one set of statements more postulational than another. Similarly, he argues that the notion of semantical rule is only sensible and meaningful relative to one or another particular enterprise of schooling unconversant persons in how to use a language. It's a teaching tool, a pedagogical device, not a fundamental property of the statements themselves. From this perspective, no one signalization of a subclass of the truths of L is intrinsically more semantical rule than another, and if analytic means true by semantical rules, No one truth of L is analytic to the exclusion of another.
Wow. So the whole attempt to ground analyticity, whether in meaning, definition, interchangeability, or even artificial rules, just collapses.
That's Quine's conclusion. He states powerfully that, for all its a priori reasonableness, a boundary between analytic and synthetic statement simply has not been drawn. That there is such a distinction to be drawn at all is an unempirical dogma of empiricists, a metaphysical article of faith, unquote. It's a belief held without empirical justification, a foundational assumption that, once examined rigorously, dissolves. And highlights a crucial consequence of this failure. It blurs the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science, setting the stage for his revolutionary alternative view of knowledge. If logic and definitions aren't fundamentally different from empirical facts, then the lines between philosophy and science begin to disappear.
What a rigorous dismantling of the analytic-synthetic distinction. It's really quite astonishing to see something that felt so self-evident just crumble under that kind of relentless scrutiny. So if we throw out that deeply ingrained dogma, where does that leave our understanding of how knowledge connects to experience? This brings us to the second pillar of empiricism Quine attacks. Reductionism, the idea that statements are somehow built directly from raw individual experiences. How does the verification theory of meaning play into this, and what does Quine find problematic about it?
This is indeed where the two dogmas really intertwine, almost like two sides of the same coin, as Quine will argue. The verification theory of meaning, a very prominent idea in logical empiricism and positivism, posits that the meaning of a statement is the method of empirically confirming or infirming it. In this framework, an analytic statement becomes a limiting case. It's confirmed no matter what, because there's no way for experience to disconfirm it. If we accept the verification theory, then statements are synonymous if they have a likeness of method of empirical confirmation or information. Their meaning is essentially their testing procedure.
Okay, meaning is how you test it. Seems reasonable on the surface.
Right, but Quine immediately asks a critical question. Just what are these methods which are to be compared for likeness? What is the nature of the relationship between a statement and the experiences which contribute to or detract from its confirmation? This question leads directly to the heart of reductionism. How precisely does a statement connect to the raw, unadulterated sensory data that supports or refutes it?
So it's like saying a recipe is the meaning of a dish. But then Quine asks, what exactly are the steps, and how do those steps relate to the actual taste of the food? It quickly gets very granular.
A great analogy. Historically, radical reductionism can be traced back to thinkers like John Locke and David Hume, who believed that every idea must either originate directly in sense experience or be compounded from such ideas. Initially, this was a term-by-term critique. For a term to be significant, it had to name a sense datum, a raw sensation like red patch or loud sound, or be a compound of such names. But Quine argued this approach was unnecessarily and intolerably restrictive. It would mean that most of our ordinary language, which includes abstract terms or general concepts, would be meaningless.
Yeah, you can't really define justice just using red patch and loud sound.
Exactly. Over time, the focus shifted. With figures like Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell, and the rise of the verification theory, the statement became the primary vehicle of meaning. This meant that statements as whole units, rather than individual terms, were now supposed to be translatable into a sense datum language. This was the ambitious task of radical reductionism, to specify such a language and then show how to translate the rest of significant discourse, statement by statement, into it. The idea was that every meaningful statement could, in principle, be broken down into a series of observations.
I think Carnap actually tried to do this.
He did. Rudolf Carnap, a leading logical empiricist, famously embarked on this project in the Aufbau, his monumental 1928 work attempting a rigorous construction of all scientific knowledge from immediate experience. He started with a very parsimonious or bare-bones extralogical basis of sense data, things like memory of similarity between experiences, or a basic experience of whole and part, and then used the powerful tools of modern logic to define a wide array of important additional sensory concepts. Carnap was genuinely the first empiricist to take serious steps towards carrying out this reduction, not just asserting its possibility. He tried to build the entire world from what you might call sensory Lego bricks.
That sounds like an incredibly ambitious project, but if I'm understanding Quine, he's arguing that Carnap's project, despite its ingenuity, ultimately failed in principle. Where did it fall short?
Exactly. Quine argues that Carnap's project fell short of reduction, not merely through sketchiness, but in principle. For example, statements about physical objects like quality Q is at point instant X, YZ, which is a way of saying a specific quality like redness exists at a particular space-time point on a physical object, could not truly be translated into Carnap's initial sense datum language, using only the primitive terms and logical tools. The crucial connective is at. The relationship between a quality and a physical object remained an added, undefined connective. It was a piece of glue that couldn't itself be built from the basic sense data bricks. The canons guiding its use, the rules for how to apply it, didn't eliminate the need for it to be an independent, undefined concept.
So you couldn't bridge the gap between raw sensation and talk about objects.
Essentially, yes. What this meant was that you couldn't truly translate statements about physical objects into statements about raw sense data. You were always left with some irreducible component. Carnap himself, Quine notes, seems to have appreciated this point later in his career, as, in his later writings, he abandoned all notion of the translatability of statements about the physical world into statements about immediate experience. Radical reductionism, in this strong form, the idea of translating every meaningful statement directly into sense data reports, has long since ceased to figure in Carnap's philosophy. It was a noble, but ultimately failed, experiment in epistemology.
So even radical reductionism in its most ambitious form ultimately failed. Yet you mentioned that the dogma itself lingered in a more subtle way. How did it persist, and how does Quine offer his truly revolutionary counter-suggestion, which, if I understand correctly, ties the two dogmas together at their very root?
You're absolutely right. Even after the failure of radical reductionism, the idea that every statement could be translated one by one into sense data, the core notion lingers that to each statement or each synthetic statement, there is associated a unique range of possible sensory events that would confirm or infirm it. This is the subtler and more tenuous form of reductionism, and it is implicit in the verification theory of meaning. It's the idea that individual statements, in isolation, can be confirmed or disconfirmed directly by experience without reference to other beliefs.
Like each statement has its own little empirical test kit?
Sort of, yes. But here's the true turning point. Quine's revolutionary counter-suggestion, often referred to as the Quine thesis. He proposes that our statements about the external world face the tribunal of sense experience not individually, but only as a corporate body. This is a radical shift from the traditional empiricist view. It means that individual statements aren't directly confirmed or refuted by individual experiences. Instead, it's our entire system of beliefs, our total science, that collectively confronts experience.
So it's not a single soldier facing the enemy, but the entire army. If a prediction fails, it's not necessarily one specific belief that's wrong, but the whole network of beliefs that led to that prediction.
Exactly. It's our entire theoretical structure that's on trial, not just one isolated proposition. And this is also where the root identity of the two dogmas becomes clear. Quine argues they are intimately connected. He explains that if it were possible to confirm or infirm statements individually, if each statement had its own distinct empirical content, then it would seem logical to also have a limiting kind of statement which is vacuously confirmed ipso facto come what may, and such a statement is analytic. In other words, if each statement had its own direct connection to experience, then a statement with no connection to experience, an analytic one, would naturally be its opposite extreme, its logical counterpart.
So if you believe in individual verification, you almost automatically believe in the possibility of analytic statements.
That's the connection Quine draws. But by showing that individual statements cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed in isolation, by insisting that they only meet experience as a corporate body, Quine simultaneously undermines the very basis for supposing that some statements could be vacuously confirmed independently of fact. If meaning and verification are holistic, then the idea of a statement being true no matter what because of its isolated meaning simply makes no sense. He concludes, the two dogmas are, indeed, at root, identical. They both stem from the same flawed assumption that meaning and truth can be compartmentalized to individual statements.
Yeah, so the two dogmas stand or fall together.
That's the argument. This profound insight leads to a grand declaration. While it's obvious that truth in general depends on both language and extralinguistic fact, that is, on how we talk about the world and how the world actually is, Quine asserts that it's nonsense, and the root of much nonsense, to speak of a linguistic component and a factual component in the truth of any individual statement. The duality between language and experience, he argues, is valid when considering science as a whole, but it's not significantly traceable into the statements of science taken one by one. It's like trying to taste the flourness or the sugarness in a baked cake. Those components are intertwined in the final product. Ultimately, for Quine, the unit of empirical significance is the whole of science. This is the foundational shift. not isolated statements, but the entire interconnected system of knowledge.
What a profound conclusion. If we throw out these two deeply ingrained dogmas, the analytic-synthetic distinction and reductionism, and embrace the idea that the unit of empirical significance is the whole of science, where does that leave our understanding of knowledge and truth? Quine doesn't leave us in a vacuum. He offers a powerful and comprehensive alternative. So what does this all mean for how we perceive our knowledge now?
It means we must radically reconceptualize knowledge. Quine offers a powerful metaphor to explain his holistic view. The totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges, or, to use another figure, total science is like a field of force whose boundary conditions are experience.
A fabric or a field of force? Okay, tell me more about this metaphor.
Imagine this fabric or field. It's a vast, intricate network of interconnected ideas, theories, observations, and logical principles. When there's a conflict with experience at the periphery, that is, when our predictions or observations don't match reality, when the fabric gets a snag on the edge, it occasions readjustments in the interior of the field. Truth values have to be redistributed across our statements. A reevaluation of one statement, because of the interconnectedness of our beliefs, entails reevaluation of others. And importantly, even the logical laws being in turn simply certain further statements of the system. Our logical principles are themselves part of this flexible web, not an unassailable foundation outside of it.
So when our knowledge hits a wall, like if a scientific experiment yields unexpected results, it's not just one isolated hypothesis that's questioned. It could be anything in that vast web, from our initial assumptions to even the very logical rules we're using. That's a truly fascinating concept, latitude of choice.
Exactly. This holistic model introduces a crucial concept, latitude of choice. The total system of beliefs is so undetermined by its boundary conditions, experience, that there is much latitude of choice as to what statements to reevaluate in the light of any single contrary experience. There's no direct one-to-one link from a specific experience to a specific statement in the interior of the web. Think of it like troubleshooting a complex system. If your computer crashes, it could be a software bug, a hardware failure, an outdated driver, or even a power surge. There's no single obvious point of failure. You have to investigate the whole system.
So we have choices about what to change when experience contradicts our beliefs.
Yes. This leads to one of Quine's most provocative claims. Any statement can be held true come what may if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. You could, for example, maintain a belief even in the face of contradictory evidence by pleading hallucination or by amending certain statements of the kind called logical laws. Conversely, and this is equally significant, no statement is immune to revision, not even the most fundamental ones. Even the logical law of the excluded middle, a cornerstone of classical logic that says a statement is either true or false with no third option, has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics.
Wait, not even logic. That's truly unsettling for some. We usually think of logic as fixed absolute truth. Are you saying that for Quine, the distinction between changing a belief about, say, what your neighbor had for dinner and revising a foundational law of physics or logic is just a matter of degree?
Precisely. Quine explicitly asks, what difference is there in principle between such a shift and the shift whereby Kepler superseded Ptolemy, or Einstein Newton, or Darwin Aristotle? This radical view implies that even logic, mathematics, and our most fundamental scientific principles are open to revision in the face of a more coherent or simpler overall system of belief. The difference is not in kind, but in the ripple effect. Revising a central belief in the web like a logical law would cause massive changes throughout the entire system, whereas revising a peripheral one, like what your neighbor ate, would be a much smaller adjustment.
Okay, so some beliefs are closer to the edge, closer to experience.
Right. Within this web, some statements are peculiarly germane to sense experience. These are the ones near the periphery. This germaneness isn't a fixed essential property, but a loose association reflecting the relative likelihood, in practice, of our choosing one statement rather than another for revision in the event of recalcitrant experience. For instance, if you look out your window and see no brick houses on Elm Street, but your map says there are, you're likely to revise your belief about brick houses on Elm Street, a peripheral statement, rather than your belief in the general laws of optics or the existence of physical objects themselves, which are more central.
So the more abstract, theoretical stuff is more insulated, more central.
Generally, yes. Highly theoretical statements of physics, logic, or ontology are relatively centrally located in the web. They have little preferential connection with any particular sense data. This means that they're not directly touched by a single observation. Our revisions, whether large or small, are often guided by a natural tendency to disturb the total system as little as possible, driven by what Quine calls conservatism and the quest for simplicity. We change what we must, but we try to preserve as much as we can, always seeking the most elegant and efficient way to organize our experience.
That's a mind-bending shift. So everything is revisable, even logic, and our choices are guided by practicality. And this leads to Quine's astonishing pragmatic view of ontology, the study of what exists, where he famously compares physical objects to the gods of Homer. Can you explain what he means by physical objects being irreducible posits and how this fits into his web of belief? That analogy is so provocative.
It is indeed one of the most striking and memorable analogies in the essay. As an empiricist, Quine views the conceptual scheme of science as a tool, ultimately, for predicting future experience in the light of past experience. Within this framework, physical objects are conceptually imported into the situation as convenient intermediaries. It's crucial. They are not by definition in terms of experience, but simply as irreducible posits comparable epistemologically to the gods of Homer.
Comparable to the gods of Homer, what does he mean epistemologically?
Now, Quine immediately clarifies his personal stance. For my part, I do, quale a physicist, believe in physical objects and not in Homer's gods, and I consider it a scientific error to believe otherwise. But the philosophical point, the epistemological footing, is that the physical objects and the gods differ only in degree and not in kind. Both, he argues, enter our conception only as cultural posits. They are useful mental constructs we adopt. The myth of physical objects is, however, epistemologically superior to most in that it has proved more efficacious than other myths as a device for working a manageable structure into the flux of experience. It's more useful, more successful at organizing our sensory inputs and making predictions. It just works better to assume physical objects exist.
So it's not that physical objects are literally myths, like Zeus on Mount Olympus. It's that our belief in them is a kind of useful fiction, a conceptual tool we adopt, because it helps us organize and predict our experiences better than any other myth we could come up with.
Exactly. He offers a clever analogy with rational and irrational numbers. Imagine you have only rational numbers, like fractions, to describe points on a line, which could be likened to our raw experience. You build an algebraic theory, but it becomes inconveniently complex because certain functions lack values or solutions. Then you discover that the rules can be simplified dramatically by positing mythical entities, like irrational numbers, like pi or the square root of 2. You're still ultimately interested in the rational numbers, in making sense of your primary data, but positing irrational ones helps you get from one law about rational numbers to another much more quickly and simply. Similarly, physical objects are posits that serve merely to simplify our treatment of experience. They are no more reducible to experience than the irrational numbers to rational numbers, but they make our overall theory, our web of belief, simpler and more powerful.
That's a great analogy. So we posit things to make the system work better.
Right. And this idea of positing doesn't stop at macroscopic objects. It extends to objects at the atomic level and beyond. Electrons, quarks, forces, gravity, electromagnetism, and even abstract entities like classes in mathematics. Quine sees science as a continuation of common sense, and both, he argues, follow the common sense expedient of swelling ontology to simplify theory. We introduce new kinds of things into our picture of reality if it helps us make better sense of the world. The goal of these elaborate myths or fictions in science is ultimately the simplicity of laws, to explain complex phenomena with the most elegant and economical theories.
So if physical objects, forces, and even mathematical entities are all useful myths, irreducible posits we adopt for the sake of simplicity and efficacy, what does this mean for traditional philosophical questions, particularly those of ontology, the study of what exists? And how does this lead to Quine's more thorough pragmatism and the concept of naturalized epistemology?
This is where Quine truly reshapes the philosophical landscape. Under this holistic view, ontological questions about what fundamentally exists, are on a par with questions of natural science. The question of whether to countenance classes as entities, meaning to accept abstract mathematical concepts as truly existing, is, for Quine, fundamentally like asking whether there are centaurs or brick houses on Elm Street. The difference, he insists, is only one of degree. It hinges on our vaguely pragmatic inclination to adjust one strand of the fabric of science rather than another in accommodating some particular recalcitrant experience. Factors like conservatism, disturbing the system as little as possible, and the quest for simplicity guide these choices.
So asking do numbers exist is the same kind of question as do electrons exist, just maybe harder to answer or affecting a different part of the web.
That's the implication. This directly challenges previous philosophical approaches, notably Carnap's. Carnap's and other logical empiricists like C.I. Lewis adopted a pragmatic stance when choosing between different language forms or scientific frameworks. They would say, for instance, that deciding to use a language that posits classes is a pragmatic choice, a matter of practical utility. However, they maintained an absolute distinction between the analytic and the synthetic to keep ontological questions strictly separate from empirical scientific hypotheses. They believed that once you chose a language, certain statements within that language were still analytically true, and questions of existence were empirical matters to be settled by science. So you chose a language pragmatically, but then you did philosophy within that language in a more traditional a priori way.
But Quine says no to that separation.
Exactly. He rejects this double standard. By repudiating the analytic-synthetic boundary, he espouses a more thorough pragmatism. He describes each individual as being given a scientific heritage, plus a continuing barrage of sensory stimulation. The considerations which guide him in warping his scientific heritage to fit his continuing sensory promptings were rational pragmatic. In essence, all our knowledge, from the most fundamental logical principles to our empirical observations, forms a unified system that is constantly being adjusted and revised based on its pragmatic utility in organizing and predicting experience. There's no separate realm of pure philosophical truth outside of the scientific enterprise.
So philosophy just becomes part of science in a way.
That's the radical move. This abandonment of the two dogmas leads directly to a blurring of the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science, because metaphysical questions about what exists are no longer separate, foundational inquiries, but become continuous with the scientific enterprise itself. It is a profound shift toward pragmatism, where the success of our conceptual scheme in dealing with the flux of experience becomes the ultimate arbiter of its truth and utility. This is the essence of naturalized epistemology, treating the study of knowledge not as an a priori philosophical endeavor undertaken prior to and independent of scientific inquiry, but as a continuous part of empirical science itself. We study knowledge the way we study any other natural phenomenon.
What a deep dive into how W.V.O. Quine fundamentally reshaped our understanding of knowledge. We've seen how he systematically dismantled the twin pillars of empiricism, the analytic-synthetic distinction and reductionism, revealing them not as self-evident truths, but as dogmas that, under rigorous scrutiny, lead to dead ends or circular reasoning. He showed us that attempts to define meaning and verify statements individually simply don't hold up.
Indeed, by showing that meaning and truth aren't simply reducible to individual statements or isolated facts, Quine shifted our focus to knowledge as a vast, interconnected, and constantly evolving web of belief. This view highlights the dynamic interplay between our conceptual schemes and the experiences they help us organize. Our entire scientific heritage, including logic and mathematics, isn't a rigid structure. It's a dynamic, adaptable tool, a man-made fabric that we continually revise at the edges where it meets raw experience.
And perhaps most provocatively, he showed us how even our most cherished scientific theories and abstract concepts like physical objects, forces, or numbers are, in a sense, useful myths, posits we adopt because they simplify and enable our engagement with the world. This radical pragmatism is truly eye-opening, reminding us that the efficacy and utility of our beliefs in navigating reality are paramount.
It pushes us to consider that all knowledge is a human construct, continually revised, adjusted, and reevaluated at the edges of experience, with no absolute unassailable core, not even in logic or mathematics. It's a testament to our ingenuity in making sense of a complex world.
And that leads to a truly compelling question to mull over. If no statement, not even a logical truth, is immune to revision, and the very boundary between metaphysics and natural science blurs, what does this imply for our pursuit of certainty in any domain of knowledge? Does it mean we can never truly know anything in an ultimate, unshakable sense? Or does it free us to be more flexible, adaptable, and pragmatic in our understanding of the world, constantly improving our conceptual tools to better navigate the flux of experience? Something to think about until our next deep dive.